The millionaire's son screamed at every nanny, but smiled at this maid. The Harrington mansion stood still on a foggy hill overlooking the San Francisco Bay. From a distance, it looked perfect. Glass walls reflecting the pale gray sky, a garden so precisely trimmed that even the roses seemed afraid to grow out of line. Yet inside, beneath the silence, a piercing sound tore through the air. The cry of a child. For 2 years, 17 nannies had entered through that front door, and every one of them had left. The last one, Emily Price, was trembling as she packed her suitcase in the grand hallway. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just can't do this anymore." From the marble staircase, Evelyn Harrington stood tall, silver hair in a perfect bun, posture unbending, eyes cold and sharp. "As always," she said, "no one these days has the patience to raise a child." Upstairs, 2-year-old Duncan Harrington was still screaming. The sound bounced off the walls and ceiling, occasionally broken by the thud of toys hitting the crib. Each sound was a desperate attempt to communicate, though no one understood. To Evelyn, it was just misbehavior. To Emily, it was the edge of sanity. But to Carolyn Torres, the quiet housekeeper downstairs, it was something else entirely. She stopped mopping and looked up toward the ceiling, where the cries vibrated through the beams. In 6 months of working there, she had heard that sound hundreds of times, and each one made her chest tighten. It wasn't the noise, it was the memory it carried. It was the same sound her son, Gabriel, used to make before he died. Carolyn closed her eyes and took a shaky breath, but the images flooded back. The sterile hospital lights, the cold beeping machines, the tiny hands clutching her shirt until they fell still. She gripped the mop harder, forcing herself back to the present. Emily came rushing down the stairs, eyes swollen with tears. "Carolyn," she said shakily, "that boy, he's not like any child I've ever met. I think he's in pain, but no one listens." She turned and hurried out. The heavy door slammed behind her, echoing through the hall like a final verdict. Evelyn remained on the stairs, arms crossed, her voice sharp and cutting. Pathetic, a 2-year-old making grown women cry. Carolyn said nothing. She lowered her head, wiping the floor again as silent tears fell, blending into the soapy water. Upstairs, Duncan's cries continued, hoarse, weary, and fading into something too deep to name. The house was beautiful, but hollow. Every polished wall, every white curtain, every immaculate surface seemed drenched in loneliness. And amid that emptiness, there was someone who truly heard. A woman who had once lost everything, whose heart now began to beat again, in sync with the silent plea of a child, whispering through his sobs, "Please help me." That night, when the house had finally sunk into silence, Carolyn Torres still couldn't sleep. She sat by the small window of the maid's room, gazing out into the dim garden below. The yellow lamplight spilled across the glass, reflecting the weary, sorrowful face of a woman who had survived only by routine. Upstairs, Duncan's faint sobs broke the stillness now and then, a small crack in the calm of the night. That fragile sound pulled her back to the place she never wanted to return, 10 years ago. Back then, they lived in a small apartment in Los Angeles. Carolyn worked as a waitress, and her husband, Carlos, was a construction worker. Life was simple, but full of laughter, until Gabriel began having strange fits of crying. At first, it was just a few tears when the lights were too bright, or when a car horn blared outside, or when someone touched him unexpectedly. But soon those small cries turned into real panic attacks. Gabriel would tremble, convulse, and bang his head against his mother's shoulder as if trying to escape a world that was too loud. Carolyn held him close, whispering through trembling breath, "Mommy's here, my love." She took him from doctor to doctor. They all said the same thing, as if reading from the same script. "You're spoiling him. All kids cry." Carlos began to change. He grew quiet, came home late, drank more, and one day he left. The last words he said before walking out were, "You made him weak, Carolyn. You broke him." The small room suddenly felt impossibly vast. Every night, Carolyn held Gabriel through endless tears, praying that morning would bring a miracle. She took him to hospitals again and again, begging in desperation, "Please, something's wrong with my son." But the shaking heads, the tired smiles, the hollow words of comfort slowly extinguished her faith. Then came one December night, rain pouring hard, thunder ripping through the sky. Gabriel suffered his worst episode yet. He screamed, clawed at his face, and hit his head on the crib until it bled. Carolyn clutched him and ran into the storm, clothes drenched, hands trembling. At the hospital, a young doctor took Gabriel from her arms. He froze, eyes wide, and whispered, "This boy isn't throwing tantrums. His brain overreacts to sound and light. It might be sensory disorder." Carolyn broke down in tears. After all those years, someone finally believed her. But it was too late. Gabriel had developed a severe infection, masked by the sensory symptoms. 3 days later, he left the world in his mother's arms, the woman who never stopped believing her child wasn't broken, only different. When Carolyn came to work at the Harrington mansion, she had no idea fate was leading her right back to the place she had fled. For the first 6 months, she tried to keep her distance. But each time she heard Duncan cry, her heart ached, and Gabriel's image returned, the little boy with deep brown eyes who cried until he had no strength left. Now, in the quiet of the night, Carolyn sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the locket with Gabriel's picture inside. She whispered, "My love, my son, if your soul still lingers, help me not be afraid. Help me save that boy." A soft breeze stirred the curtain, tilting the golden light. Carolyn took a deep breath, feeling something small yet powerful brush against her heart. She stood up and looked toward the ceiling, toward where Duncan slept after his long crying spell. Her gaze softened, and for the first time in years, she smiled, a painful but determined smile. The next morning, sunlight shimmered on the surface of the water, reflecting against the glass walls of the house like a giant mirror. But no matter how bright the sun shone, inside that house the air remained as cold as ice. Evelyn Harrington, 63 years old, always began her day precisely at 6 o'clock in the morning. She wore a dark blue wool dress, tied her hair neatly into a bun, and descended the staircase with the steady sound of her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Everything in the house followed her rhythm. Breakfast at 7, cleaning at 8, absolute silence after 9. For Evelyn, order was the only way to keep a family standing. On the living room wall hung dozens of awards and photographs of her son, Richard Harrington, founder of one of the largest real estate companies in the state. In those pictures, Richard smiled brightly, shaking hands with partners, cutting ribbons at grand openings. But that smile no longer existed in real life. Richard usually left home at 6 in the morning and returned after 10 at night. Work, projects, contracts. He buried himself in them like a man running from his own pain. Ever since his wife Anna had died from postnatal complications, Richard had not been the same. He refused to say her name, refused to speak of the loss, and never entered the room where she had once lain. Evelyn believed that time would heal everything. But the only thing time had done was turn the house into a sealed box filled with weary souls. Duncan, Richard's little boy, was the one who bore it all. At 2 years old, he lived surrounded by silence, by the dry echo of footsteps, and by sharp, emotionless commands. "Don't cry," she said. "Don't dirty your clothes," she said. "You don't need hugs," she said. But what she didn't know was that each command made the boy shrink a little more inside. In the kitchen, Carolyn worked quietly, washing each plate under the steady sound of running water. She had been working there for 6 months and had yet to hear a single thank you from anyone in the family. Sometimes, when passing through the hallway, she saw her employer, Richard, sitting in his office under the dim yellow light, his head resting in his hands. On the desk lay a small photo of Anna and newborn Duncan. He would stare at it for a long time, then put it away in a drawer, as if hiding his grief from the world. Evelyn, however, was different. She didn't believe in tears. "My son is successful because I was strict," she often said. "If I had been soft, he would never have become who he is today." But Richard no longer believed those words. He just didn't know how to change. That evening, as Carolyn was wiping the dining table, Evelyn called her over. "Tomorrow, the new nanny will arrive. I hope she isn't as weak as the others," Evelyn said coldly. "Yes, ma'am," Carolyn replied softly. Mrs. Evelyn glanced at her with icy eyes. "Do not interfere with the child's upbringing. You're here to keep things clean. Understood?" Carolyn nodded, though a wave of bitterness rose inside her. She had heard Duncan crying all day, a cry identical to Gabriel's years ago. And what frightened her most wasn't the crying, but the silence that followed. The kind of silence that meant a child had stopped calling for help because he already knew no one would answer. That night, the house was once again eerily quiet. Richard stayed in his office. Evelyn sat reading in her chair. Carolyn cleaned under the dim light. Upstairs, Duncan no longer cried. Carolyn lifted her head, listening. For a moment, she caught a tiny sound, a weak, trembling breath. She whispered softly, as if making a promise to herself. "Tomorrow, if no one listens to that boy, I will." The next morning, fog still blanketed the hill. From the kitchen window, Carolyn Torres watched as a silver car stopped in front of the mansion gate. A young woman stepped out, pulling a small suitcase and a fabric bag full of colorful toys. "That must be her," Carolyn whispered. The gate opened automatically, and Evelyn Harrington was already standing in the doorway, composed yet cold. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington," the young woman said cheerfully. "I'm Nadia Jenkins from Bright Care Agency. I'm here to take care of Duncan." Evelyn's eyes scanned her from head to toe. Sneakers, a ponytail, that open smile. "I hope you're not under the impression that this job will be easy," she said in her clipped, steady tone. 17 nannies before you couldn't last 3 weeks. Nadia's smile didn't fade. "I understand, ma'am. I've worked with children who have special needs before. Every child is a world of their own, and I'd love to get to know Duncan's world." A flicker of irritation crossed Evelyn's face. "Here, we believe in discipline and structure. No talk of special worlds. Children must learn to obey." Carolyn, polishing the table nearby, froze for a second. The air felt tight, charged, but Nadia stood calmly. "I respect your approach," she said softly, "but I also believe that sometimes a child needs to be understood before they can be taught." Evelyn pressed her lips together. "We'll see if you still think that in a few days." They walked down the hallway and climbed the stairs. Carolyn followed quietly, pretending to work just to listen. "This is Duncan's room," Evelyn said, opening the door. The room was flooded with cold white light, spotless, almost sterile. In the corner, the little boy sat in his crib, clutching a worn-out stuffed animal, his face pale and distant. "Hi there," Nadia said gently, kneeling down to his level. "I'm Nadia." Duncan looked at her for a few seconds, said nothing, then turned away. "It's best if you don't talk too much," Evelyn interjected. "He doesn't like attention." But Nadia only smiled. "That's all right. I've got time." She set her bag down, pulled out a small yellow ball, and rolled it gently toward him. The ball touched Duncan's foot and stopped. He didn't move at first, then slowly reached out and tapped it with one tiny finger. Carolyn, standing in the doorway, held her breath. It was just a small gesture, but it was enough to make her heart stir. In that brief moment, the harsh light softened, and the cold house seemed to warm by a single degree. Evelyn crossed her arms, displeased, and turned away. "Do your job," she said sharply. Carolyn watched her leave, then looked back at Nadia and Duncan. No one else in that house noticed, but something had shifted. Small, fragile, almost invisible. Yet it might just be the beginning of everything. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting long stripes across the living room floor. Evelyn Harrington sat upright in her armchair, a leather notebook perfectly balanced on her lap. Across from her, Nadia Jenkins sat with her own small pad, ready to take notes. "Before we begin," Evelyn said in her precise, clipped tone, "there are a few house rules you need to understand." "Yes, ma'am," Nadia replied politely, her smile steady but slightly strained. "Rule number 1, Evelyn lifted a finger. No unnecessary holding or hugging. I don't believe in comforting. A child must learn self-control early." Nadia paused her pen. "Ma'am, Duncan is only 2 years old. At that age, physical affection is an important part of emotional development." Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharp as glass. "I don't need you to teach me how to raise children. My son was raised this way, and he's one of the most successful men I know." Nadia looked up, her eyes calm, only a trace of sadness flickering there. "He may be successful," she said softly, "but does that mean he's happy?" The room froze. Carolyn, dusting the bookshelf nearby, felt her heart stop for a second. Evelyn's brow tightened. She slammed the notebook shut. "I didn't hire you to philosophize. Keep writing." "Rule number 2, she continued, voice growing sharper. "Duncan eats at fixed times, 8, 12, and 6. Not earlier, not later. If he's hungry outside those hours, he must learn to wait. The world doesn't revolve around a child." Nadia wrote slowly. "Understood, ma'am." "Rule number 3, Evelyn went on. "No colorful or noisy toys. I won't have my home turned into a circus. Simplicity builds focus." Nadia glanced at her bag of toys, bright rubber balls, painted wooden blocks. And for a second, her hands trembled. Then she smiled faintly. "I'll do my best, ma'am." Evelyn gave a curt nod, the faint smile of someone who believes she has won. "Good. I hope you'll last longer than the others. None made it past 3 days." Nadia looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not leaving. I came here for Duncan." Evelyn arched an eyebrow, unconvinced, and rose to her feet. "We'll see how long that promise lasts." She walked away, leaving behind the faint, sharp scent of perfume. Carolyn turned toward Nadia, eyes full of something between worry and admiration. "Are you sure you can handle this?" she asked quietly, once Evelyn was gone. Nadia smiled, a gentle but determined smile. "I've met many children like Duncan, but I've never met anyone quite like her." Both women laughed softly, a brief spark of warmth inside a house still heavy with silence. Carolyn picked up her cloth again, returning to her work, but inside her chest stirred something unfamiliar. Fear mixed with hope. She knew Evelyn's rules were only the surface, a disguise for pain long buried, wrapped in control. By noon the next day, the dining room was blazing with light. The white crystal chandelier poured its glow directly onto the table, bouncing off the glassware until the entire space seemed to burn in a dazzling glare. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Harrington, her posture rigid, fingers interlocked. Across from her, Nadia Jenkins, the 18th nanny, carefully placed a bowl of pumpkin soup in front of Duncan. "This is your favorite, Duncan," Nadia said softly, trying to keep her voice gentle. "I made it just the way your mother used to." Duncan looked at the bowl, his eyes wide. He didn't touch the spoon, The brightness of the light made him squint, then whimper softly as his tiny hands moved up to cover his ears. Evelyn frowned, displeased. "Duncan, eat. Stop this nonsense," she said coldly. "Ma'am," Nadia murmured. "The light might be bothering him, I think." "Don't think," Evelyn snapped, tapping her fingers sharply on the table. "I told you, you spoil him too much. A child must learn to endure." From the adjoining kitchen, Carolyn Torres was stacking plates, hearing every word. Evelyn's icy tone mingled with the dry clinking of silver against porcelain. Carolyn froze, listening. Then a scream tore through the air. Duncan shrieked, the sound sharp as glass. Nadia jumped, dropping the spoon. "It's okay, Duncan. It's just the light," she said quickly. "I'll dim it, all right?" "No," Evelyn barked, slamming her hand on the table. The sound made Duncan flinch, his body trembling, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Sit still! Stop pretending!" Duncan cried harder, scratching his own face until red streaks appeared on his delicate skin. Nadia panicked, rising from her chair. "Mrs. Harrington, please, let me comfort him." "No," Evelyn cut her off, her voice like iron. "Let him cry until he's tired. If you pick him up, he'll learn to manipulate you." The crying filled the room, chaotic, raw, unbearable. Each sob from Duncan felt like a knife twisting in Carolyn's chest. She took a step back, hand over her heart, pulse pounding. She had heard this sound before. Gabriel, her son, used to cry just like that, helpless, desperate, unbelieved. Unable to bear it any longer, Carolyn dropped the stack of dishes and ran out of the kitchen. The crash of porcelain shattered through the air. Evelyn turned sharply, fury in her eyes. "What do you think you're doing, Carolyn?" she snapped. "Get back to the kitchen this instant!" Carolyn didn't answer. She had seen Duncan, and for a heartbeat, the blood in her veins seemed to stop. The little boy was strapped tightly into his high chair. His face was flushed crimson, tears mixed with blood from the scratches on his cheeks. His body trembled violently, small hands jerking uncontrollably. Nadia stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Harrington, please," Nadia pleaded. "He can't take this anymore. You're hurting him." Evelyn pointed a rigid finger at her. "Be quiet. Touch him, and you're fired immediately." "Duncan isn't pretending," Carolyn said, her voice low and trembling, but firm. "He's in real pain. Look at him, ma'am." "You have no right to interfere." Evelyn advanced toward her, eyes blazing. "You're just a cleaner, not a doctor, not his mother." Carolyn didn't back down. She rushed to Duncan's side, bending over him, her hands shaking as she unbuckled the strap. "It's okay, Duncan," she whispered. "I'm here. Breathe, sweetheart." "Stop!" Evelyn shouted, but Nadia stepped between them. "Please, Mrs. Harrington," she cried. "Don't hurt him any more." Carolyn freed the boy. Duncan collapsed into her arms, his small body limp, breaths broken and shallow. He trembled like a frightened bird. Carolyn held him close, one hand gently rubbing his back, her voice soft and rhythmic as a lullaby. "Shh. Breathe, my love. Slowly now. I'm here." The screams still echoed, shorter now, broken by sobs. The small body in Carolyn's arms began to ease, the violent tremors fading into faint shivers. Carolyn closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and did what her instincts told her to do. She gently tossed Duncan into the air, not high, just enough for him to feel the motion, and caught him securely in her hands. Once, twice, 3 times. Evelyn shouted, "You've lost your mind. Stop this at once." But Nadia grabbed her arm, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "Look, Mrs. Harrington, look at his face." Duncan was no longer crying. He was breathing hard, his wide eyes fixed on Carolyn, and for the first time in hours, that gaze wasn't filled with fear. It was wonder. Carolyn lifted him again, steady, safe, gentle. And then, like a small miracle in the middle of the storm, Duncan laughed. The sound was clear, raspy, but real. A short, pure burst of joy that filled the air. Evelyn's mouth fell open. Nadia covered her face with her hands, sobbing softly. Carolyn froze, tears spilling down her cheeks. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Duncan, the child who had known only fear and tears, was laughing. He tilted his head back, waiting for her to toss him again, tiny hands reaching upward, lips curved into a radiant smile. Again, Carolyn heard him whisper through his breath. She obeyed, lifting him once more, lighter this time. He laughed again, louder, longer. Duncan's laughter filled the room, echoing off the cold walls, cutting through the heavy air, rising into the bright white light above. Evelyn trembled, her voice cracking as she stammered, "How? How did it stop? How can he laugh?" Carolyn held Duncan close, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. Because he was never misbehaving. His brain was overloaded. The light, the sounds, the smells, they all attacked him at once. His body couldn't take it. She looked directly into Evelyn's eyes, her tone both tender and resolute. Children like him don't need to be disciplined. They need to be understood. This motion, it helps his body reorganize what's inside, find order again in the chaos the world forces on him. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The air was so still that only Duncan's faint breathing could be heard, mingled with Nadia's quiet sobs. Even the light above seemed softer now, no longer blinding. Evelyn took a step back, her eyes still locked on her grandson. For the first time, her gaze was not stern, but uncertain, trembling. Carolyn bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to Duncan's forehead. He rested his head on her shoulder, eyes closed, a small smile still on his lips. And in that stillness, a miracle had happened. The sound of laughter faded, dissolving into the stillness of the room. Carolyn was still holding Duncan in her arms, his face glowing with joy, while her eyes shimmered with tears. Nadia stood beside her, hand over her mouth, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. Evelyn Harrington slowly stepped back, her lips trembling, no words coming out. And then the front door swung open. A man's voice echoed, rough but steady. "Mother, what's going on here?" Everyone turned. Richard Harrington, in a gray suit, stood at the doorway, his face weary from a long day, but his eyes widened in disbelief at the sight before him. Carolyn stood in the middle of the room, holding Duncan, the boy no one had been able to soothe for months, now laughing, resting his head on her shoulder, completely at peace. Richard took a slow step forward, his voice softening. "Duncan, are you laughing?" Duncan turned, his eyes bright. "Daddy!" he cried out, his voice trembling but full of joy. "Daddy, fly!" In that instant, Richard froze. He looked at Carolyn, the woman he knew only as the cleaning lady, and saw something in her eyes that made his heart tighten, the gentleness of a mother and the deep sorrow of someone who had once lost everything. Evelyn spoke, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Richard, she threw him in the air. She's insane." But Richard didn't hear her. His gaze was fixed on Duncan, the little boy laughing for the first time since his mother's death. He stepped closer. "Son." Duncan reached out his arms toward him, still smiling. Carolyn gently placed the boy into his father's arms and whispered, "Hold him tight. He needs to feel safe." Richard's hands trembled as he held his son. Duncan rested his head against his chest. Evelyn stood frozen, her face pale. The room fell silent, only the sound of father and son breathing in unison. After a few moments, Richard looked up at Carolyn. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice breaking. Carolyn replied softly, "There's no magic, sir. I just listen to him. He's not difficult. He just can't express what he feels. His body's been crying for help, Nadia added, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Evelyn didn't understand, but Miss Carolyn saved him. Richard said nothing. He looked down at his son, peaceful, eyes closed, a calm expression he hadn't seen in years. He held the boy tighter and whispered, "Thank you." Carolyn shook her head gently. "I didn't do anything. Duncan fought for himself. I only gave him a little space to find his way back." Evelyn turned away, her voice faint. "You don't understand, Richard. Your son needs discipline, not—" "No, Mother," Richard interrupted firmly, his voice filled with emotion. "My son needs love." Carolyn bent down, placed a hand on Duncan's shoulder, and whispered, "You're so strong, Duncan. You did it." The boy smiled in his sleep, his tiny hand still clutching his father's shirt. For the first time in years, the house was silent. But it was a peaceful silence, not a heavy one. Through the window, the afternoon sun spilled in, glinting off the tear that shimmered on Carolyn's face. Evelyn quietly left the room without another word. Richard remained there, holding his son, watching Carolyn, the woman who had done what the world could not. And deep inside, he knew, from this moment on, everything had changed forever. A week after that fateful afternoon, the mansion on the hill was no longer filled with cries or angry voices. Instead, it echoed with the gentle sound of wind brushing through the curtains and the soft melody of piano music every morning. Everything began to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, like dawn breaking after a stormy night. Richard Harrington had called in a renowned sensory therapy specialist from the city. The man listened carefully as Carolyn described Duncan's crisis, how he reacted to light, sound, and smells. After a moment of silence, he finally said, "She's right. The boy suffers from severe sensory processing disorder. But what's remarkable is that someone finally listened to him." Richard turned to Carolyn, his voice sincere. "You're not leaving, Carolyn. From now on, you're Duncan's primary caregiver. No one understands my son the way you do." At that moment, Nadia Jenkins stood quietly in the corner, her eyes glistening with tears. She smiled, trying to hide her emotion. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "I think it's time for me to go." Both Richard and Carolyn turned to her. "You don't have to," Carolyn said quickly. "Duncan likes you." Nadia shook her head, smiling sadly. "No, Carolyn, Duncan needs you. When he looks at you, there's peace in his eyes, a kind of calm I've never seen before. I came here to help, but you're the one who saved his soul." Richard stepped forward, grasping her hand with gratitude. "Thank you, Nadia." The next day, Nadia left the mansion. Carolyn stood at the gate to see her off. They hugged tightly. "Keep in touch," Carolyn whispered. "Of course," Nadia replied. From that day on, the house began to change. The dining room lights were replaced with soft golden ones, and the curtains thickened to shield harsh sunlight. Sharp sounds disappeared, replaced by gentle piano tunes in the mornings. The smell of bleach was gone, only the faint scent of lavender lingered in the hallways. Duncan was the first to change. He began to sleep better. The panic attacks came less often. Every morning, Carolyn found him sitting on the carpet, lining up wooden blocks, quietly humming along to the music. Richard often stood by the doorway, watching silently. He didn't say anything, just smiled, a rare smile after so many years. And Evelyn Harrington, who had once believed in absolute discipline, now had to relearn the simplest thing of all, how to hold her grandson. At first she was awkward, stiff, afraid of frightening Duncan. But Carolyn patiently guided her, step by step. "Don't be afraid, just hold him with your heart. You don't need to say anything, just let him feel that you're here." One morning, Duncan ran up to her, arms outstretched. "Grandma, I want a hug." Evelyn froze. She looked at Carolyn, then slowly bent down and wrapped her arms around him. Duncan giggled, resting his head against her chest. Evelyn trembled, and for the first time in years, a tear rolled down her cheek onto the child's shoulder. From that day, she stopped giving orders. She began to ask instead, "Duncan, what would you like today?" And when he spoke, she listened, truly listened. Meanwhile, the bond between Carolyn and Richard grew stronger, wordlessly, naturally. He started coming home earlier each day. They would sit on the floor together with Duncan, teaching him to name emotions: sad, happy, scared, joyful. Sometimes their eyes met, just for a moment, but it was enough for both to understand that the loneliness inside them was no longer theirs alone. One late evening, after tucking Duncan into bed, Richard found Carolyn folding blankets in the living room. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not just for my son, but for bringing life back to this house." Carolyn smiled softly. "I only cleaned something else, not the floors, but the heart." They looked at each other, their eyes filled with gratitude and a glimmer of hope. One afternoon, as the sunset bathed the garden in gold, Evelyn stepped onto the porch where Carolyn was watering the plants. She stood there for a long moment before speaking softly. "Carolyn." Carolyn turned, gentle as ever. "Yes, ma'am?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I was wrong." Carolyn said nothing. Evelyn continued. "I thought love had to be strict, bound by rules, but it turns out it only needs to listen." Carolyn walked closer, taking her hand gently. "We've all been wrong before, ma'am. What matters is that now Duncan has a grandmother who knows how to love him the right way." Evelyn smiled weakly, another tear falling. In the glow of the evening light, the two women stood side by side, from two different worlds, yet both finally healing together. More than a year had passed since the day everything began to change. The Harrington house was now filled with light and laughter. Beneath the rose arbor, Carolyn sat reading, the scent of blossoms curling around her like a soft ribbon of perfume. In the middle of the garden, Duncan ran barefoot, chasing butterflies, while Richard came out carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. He set one down in front of her and took a seat beside her. A gentle breeze brushed past. The roses swayed. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across their hands, warm and tender. From the middle of the garden, Duncan came running toward them, arms wide open. "Mommy, Daddy, I really flew!" Carolyn laughed, gathering the boy into her arms. In the golden bloom of the garden, the 3 of them stood close together. No past, no pain anymore, only love, simple and complete.